warning Russia that invading Ukraine would lead to a terrible loss of life, and likening this to the Soviet takeover of Afghanistan. In a speech in Sydney, the Foreign Secretary accused Russia of wanting to recreate the Soviet Union and urged President Vladimir Putin to step back. A warning came ahead of talks between the US and Russia. Russia, of course, denies it is planning an invasion, but has moved 100,000 troops near to its border with Ukraine. Cormac Smith is a former strategic communication advisor to the Ukraine Foreign Minister Pavlovich Klimkin. Good afternoon to you, Cormac.
Ian, good afternoon to you, sir.
Nice to have you with us. Is Liz Truss correct in this analysis?
I think Liz Truss is absolutely spot on with her analysis. We've got to remember that Putin has already said a number of years ago that the dissolution of the Soviet Union he considered to be the worst geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, and he has made it, very clear. Now, a bit of context: in 1991, Ukraine voted by 92% of its population for independence from Russia. Since then, in particular, since Maidan in 2014, the country has moved on a number of measures further and further to the west and further away from Russia. But this war against Ukraine probably in truth started back in 2004 with the Orange Revolution and the assassination or the attempted poisoning of Viktor Yushchenko. But as Putin has got stronger, he has made it very, very clear that he wants Ukraine back. There's two reasons for this. One, Ukraine was the jewel in the crown of the Soviet Union. It was one of 15 Soviet states that had accounted for 40% of the GDP of the entire Soviet Union. But the other thing that's a huge threat to Putin is, there is nothing as a greater threat to the survival of the current kleptocratic Kremlin regime than a successful, free, and democratic Ukraine on its doorstep. This is what I believe, and many of my Ukrainian friends believe, Putin fears the most. It was very interesting. Our defense secretary wrote a very good piece at the start of the week where he said the whole idea of threats from NATO were basically a straw dog, a straw man, which had been created by Putin. Putin is not threatened by NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance. As you know, and most of the listeners hopefully will know, NATO will never invade Ukraine. And Putin, as the Kremlin does, creates false narratives to suit itself. What threatens Putin and the Kremlin regime is a free, prosperous, successful Ukraine, because that will be fuel to the fire of the nascent democratic movement back home in Russia.
Putin has sent 100,000 troops to the border. This is not insignificant, a huge number. What would be your best guess as to why they are there then? If Putin says nothing to see here, what is the reason for sending so many?
I think we need to stop saying 100,000. We've been saying that for some time. The most recent figures I heard was 127,000.
Wow. So
and probably as many again with in reserve a couple of 100 miles back. And he has just recently in the last few days moved considerable forces into Belarus also. So effectively, Ukraine has been surrounded. What is the purpose? Clearly, the purpose is to intimidate. And we know that Putin has been making some absolutely ridiculous demands of both NATO and the Americans. And those demands, which don't only extend to Ukraine, but they extend to, he threatened strikes on unspecified NATO targets. Those demands have all been turned down point blank by both Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, and the American president. So the calculus for Putin now is he's painted himself into a bit of a corner. Does he actually invade, or does he stop down, or does he pull back? It's very, very hard to see how Putin can not escalate the aggression and save face. And certainly, I was in Kiev before Christmas. I speak to friends and former colleagues in Kiev virtually every day. And the mood in Kiev is one of, they're incredibly calm, but it's one of quiet resignation. They are expecting an invasion. 30% of the country in a recent poll have said they will take up arms and fight. That's like 12 or 13 million people, Ian. They have the largest standing army in Europe and a reserve estimated at 900,000, many of them battle-hardened.
So when it comes to boots on the ground, they can defend themselves. What would you say to this, Cormac? I had this text in from Chris who says, those Russian troops are there as normal. The fear of an attack comes from the fact that the Ukrainians have tapped into the Russian gas pipeline, crossing their territory, stealing gas and selling it on. Putin will do the right thing at the right time because he's a real leader and not a corporate maggot. How would you respond?
Right. I don't know who this person is. A useful idiot for the Kremlin, no doubt. Look, the foreign minister that I used to work for, Pavlo Klimkin, coined a phrase. He said, Russia lies on an industrial scale. There is absolutely no substance, to my knowledge, and I'm pretty plugged into what's going on. There is no substance, to my knowledge, whatsoever that Ukraine is tapping into the pipeline and stealing gas. The whole purpose of Nord Stream 2 was to cut out Ukraine as a transit country, one which denies Ukraine massive transit fees which they have earned from the transit pipeline, but also most people are increasingly agreeing, apart from the Germans unfortunately, that this allows Putin to further weaponize gas supplies to Europe, and we know what's happening with the gas prices at the moment. So I would refute that claim out of hand. Absolutely. In fact, it's the first time I've heard anything. Well, I've heard other outrageous claims from the.
But the first time you've actually heard that.
It's the first time I've heard that, and.
Just give us, Cormac, just a point on how much support Putin does or doesn't have in Ukraine itself. The population of Ukraine is roughly
43 million.
About 43 million people. What percentage of those 43 million would quite like to see Russia back in the game, running the show?
I don't know what the exact figure is. It would be very, very small. As I said, in 1991, 92% of the Ukrainian population voted for independence. For the first 10 years or so, up to about 2004, Ukraine stayed fairly close. It was the first Ukrainian president to signal that he was going to take Ukraine further to the west was Viktor Yushchenko, who they tried to assassinate in the same way as they tried to assassinate Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury in 2018. And I know about both of these two things because I've sat at a dinner table with the Yushchenkos and been told this, and I worked in our own security communications team to counter the Russian disinformation that was flowing out of the Kremlin at the time of the Skripal attempted murders, when of course the Kremlin were denying it point blank and putting out all sorts of ridiculous stories. I remember one at the time that we identified was that the Novichok had simply blown in on the wind from Portland down. There was another false narrative that Theresa May had done it. There was another one that the CIA had done it. Yeah. The Foreign Office actually identified 47 false narratives. This is part of what the Kremlin does as part of its hybrid warfare mix. So to get back to your question, I can't give you a figure. People sometimes erroneously say, well, half of Ukraine is Russian speaking. That is absolutely irrelevant. There are people putting their lives on the front line in Donbass every day who are native Russian speakers. The minister I worked for, Pavlo Klimkin, was born in Kursk in Russia. He was educated in Moscow. A more patriotic, and therefore his first language would have been Russian rather than Ukrainian. A more patriotic Ukrainian you could not meet. And actually I had a few pints with Pavlo. He's no longer minister, but I had a few pints with him before Christmas when I was out in Kiev to visit some people. So it's very important. This is another false narrative.
Okay.
Nothing can be taken out of the language.
So any support is small, is your point. Cormac, thank you for that. Very thorough stuff. Cormac Smith, former strategic communication advisor to the Ukrainian former foreign minister, Pavlo Klimkin, that he was just referring to there.